Most lives don't fall apart in loud, dramatic moments. They fall apart quietly, inside ordinary seconds that feel harmless at the time. Not the night someone leaves. Not the day a secret is exposed. But the moments when action is possible and delayed. The apology you plan to give later. The conversation you avoid because it feels uncomfortable. The knock on a bedroom door you decide to make tomorrow instead. Those moments decide everything. He didn't lose his family the day the truth came out. He lost them in the moments when he chose later over now. Because hesitation is still a decision. That morning, he stood barefoot on the cold kitchen tile, staring at the wall clock above the sink. The second hand ticked unevenly, stalling, stuttering, then jumping forward as if embarrassed by its own delay. He had noticed it weeks ago. The fix would take 10 minutes. Remove the back. Replace the mechanism. Hang it again. But fixing it would mean admitting something in the house was broken. He let it tick the way it wanted. He poured himself coffee, though he wasn't really thirsty, and drank it slowly while watching time misbehave. The kitchen was spotless, almost sterile. Nothing left out. Nothing waiting to be finished. It looked less like a home and more like a place someone passed through on their way somewhere else. He rinsed the mug and placed it upside down on the counter, left of the sink, handle turned inward. He didn't think about why he did it that way. Habit had a way of surviving longer than people. His wife used to leave it there every morning. Same spot, same angle. Back when mornings were filled with conversation instead of silence. Back when the house smelled like butter and vanilla instead of disinfectant and nothing at all. Upstairs, a bedroom door was closed. Music played softly behind it. Low, steady, unfamiliar. Not loud enough to complain about. Not quiet enough to ignore. He paused, listening, his hand hovering near the staircase. He could knock. He could say, "Good morning." He could ask how school was going, or whether breakfast was wanted, or whether anything at all needed to be talked about. Instead, he reached for his phone. A message waited on the screen. "Are you coming by tonight?" No demands, no questions, no expectations spelled out. Just an invitation that required nothing more than presence, and even that came without strings. He stared at the message longer than necessary, then typed a single word. Yes. The decision settled instantly. Clean, efficient, final. That was how he liked decisions to feel. From upstairs, the music stopped. For a brief moment, he imagined the door opening. Imagined being asked where he was going so early. Imagined having to explain himself in real time instead of later, when things were calmer, easier, less complicated. The footsteps moved away from the door. He exhaled, surprised by the relief. He grabbed his keys and jacket and left the house quietly, as if silence itself could prevent things from breaking further. Outside, the morning air was cool and sharp. It felt honest in a way nothing inside the house had for a long time. In the driveway, His car waited. Polished, reliable, expensive. It always responded when he turned the key. He appreciated that. As he drove away, he passed the park at the corner of the street. The crooked bench near the oak tree caught his eye, and with it came an image he hadn't invited, a smaller version of his son wobbling on a bike, knees scraped, face set in determination. "Watch me," the boy had called out. "Watch me." He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and kept driving. At work, everything made sense. Meetings began on time. Problems were identified and solved. People listened when he spoke. Decisions carried weight. Action produced results. This was the world that rewarded immediacy. Someone praised his instincts. Someone else joked about how calm he always seemed under pressure. He smiled when appropriate. He nodded. He delivered outcomes. By the time evening came, the image of the clock had faded beneath forecasts and projections. Life once again divided itself neatly into what demanded action and what could wait. Her apartment overlooked the river, all glass and clean lines. The city reflected itself back perfectly. Movement, purpose, momentum. When she opened the door, she smiled easily, warmly, without hesitation. "You look tired," she said. "I'm fine," he replied, because it was easier than asking himself whether it was true. She accepted the answer without question. They cooked together, in comfortable silence. She reached for spices before he asked. He poured wine without checking if she wanted it. Their rhythm felt practiced, effortless, free of history. Later, she rested her head against his shoulder and spoke softly. "You don't have to stay," she said. "Thou should be them." The word "them" landed heavier than she intended. "I'm here," he said. And he was, technically, but his mind drifted back to another kitchen, another time, a version of himself who believed love could be postponed without consequence. That night, lying alone in his apartment, he stared at the ceiling and replayed the day in fragments. The clock, the message, the closed door upstairs. None of it felt dramatic. None of it felt like a mistake. And that was the danger. Because the moments that ruin us rarely feel important when they happen. They arrive disguised as convenience, as comfort, as something we promise ourselves we'll deal with later. He closed his eyes and told himself the same thing he always did. Tomorrow, unaware that tomorrow, like the clock on his wall, was already moving forward, unevenly, relentlessly, whether he chose to act or not. By every visible measure, his life was intact. The house stood where it always had. Manicured lawn, trimmed with mechanical precision. The cars in the driveway were washed weekly, serviced on schedule, dependable. The refrigerator was stocked. The bills were paid before they were due. Nothing was missing in ways people could point to. That was the danger of appearances. They offered proof without truth. He moved through his days with the confidence of a man who believed he was doing everything required of him. He provided, he protected, he solved problems before they grew large enough to alarm anyone. When challenges surfaced, he handled them swiftly, decisively, and without complaint. It was how he'd built his reputation, how he'd built his fortune. In meetings, people admired his clarity. He didn't hesitate. He didn't overthink. While others debated possibilities, he chose a direction and moved. That decisiveness had saved companies, secured deals, and earned loyalty. At home, he mistook the same speed for strength. He believed silence meant stability. He believed the absence of arguments meant peace. He believed love, once established, could survive on maintenance alone. He didn't notice when conversations shortened, when eye contact faded, when shared routines quietly dissolved into separate ones. He told himself it was maturity, growth, the natural settling that followed years together. But settling was not the same as staying. His wife noticed long before he did. She noticed the way he answered questions without really listening, the way he nodded while checking his phone, the way later became a permanent answer. She noticed how presence turned conditional, something offered only after exhaustion, only if there was time left. She remembered the early years vividly. The cramped apartment, the late nights filled with plans and laughter, the way he used to sit at the edge of the bed, shoes still on, talking through ideas until sleep overtook them both. Back then, ambition had been shared. It had drawn them closer. Now it stood between them. She tried at first. She spoke carefully, choosing words that wouldn't sound like accusation. She mentioned feeling distant, unseen, lonely in ways that didn't make sense on paper. He listened, but only enough to reassure her that everything was fine. "We're good," he'd say. "Things are just busy right now." Busy became permanent. Right now stretched endlessly forward. And so she adjusted. She learned to speak less, to wait, to manage disappointment quietly. She stopped asking certain questions because she already knew the answers, or worse, knew they wouldn't come at all. Their son noticed, too. Children always do. He noticed when his father stopped showing up for small things. The practices, the conversations that started and ended at the doorway. The way attention was present, physically, but absent emotionally. At first, he tried harder. He brought drawings, stories, questions meant to impress. Eventually, he stopped. That withdrawal happened so slowly it felt natural, like growing up, like independence. But it wasn't growth. It was adaptation. And adaptation, when forced too early, leaves scars. Meanwhile, another part of his life grew easier. She didn't ask questions. She didn't require explanations. With her, silence felt like relief instead of rejection. She listened without expectation and smiled without demand. He could arrive tired and leave unchanged. That simplicity felt like peace. He told himself he wasn't choosing her over his family. He told himself it was temporary. A release valve, something that existed separately from the life that truly mattered. But leaves don't stay separate forever. They bleed into each other. Quietly, relentlessly. At home, his wife felt the shift without understanding its shape at first. A subtle absence layered over an already fragile distance. She sensed something else occupying space where intimacy used to live. One evening, she asked him directly, not angrily, not dramatically, "Are you still here with me?" she asked. He laughed softly, the way people do when a question feels unnecessary. "Of course I am." And in that moment, he believed it. That was another lesson he hadn't learned yet. Believing something doesn't make it true. Weeks passed, then months. He continued to succeed. Headlines praised his focus, his resilience, his ability to lead without distraction. People admired his discipline, unaware of what that discipline had quietly pushed aside. At night, when the house was quiet, his wife lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling. She replayed conversations, moments, small dismissals that added up to something heavier than anger. She wasn't furious. She was tired of carrying memory alone, tired of adjusting expectations downward, tired of loving someone who treated attention like a limited resource. The morning she finally understood what had been happening, there was no confrontation, no shouting, just clarity. Clarity has a way of rearranging everything. She packed quietly, folded clothes with care, chose what to take and what to leave behind. Their son stood in the hallway, watching, absorbing the moment the way children do, without commentary, without interruption. When he finally spoke, it was simple. "You chose her." The sentence landed cleanly. No accusation, no confusion, just observation. He opened his mouth to explain, to clarify, to correct, to defend himself. But something stopped him. For the first time, he saw the moment clearly, not as intent, not as justification, but as outcome. And outcomes, unlike intentions, don't argue back. That night, after the house emptied and silence settled differently than before, he sat alone and tried to trace the moment everything had changed. He couldn't find it because there wasn't one. There were hundreds, moments that felt too small to matter at the time. Moments when action was possible and postponed. When attention was available and withheld. When love asked quietly and was told to wait. The truth settled slowly, heavily, and without drama. His life hadn't fallen apart because of one mistake. It had unraveled because he kept choosing what felt easy in the moment and calling it harmless. And the cost of that choice was only just beginning to reveal itself. If this chapter made you think about a moment you delayed, a conversation you postponed, or a choice you told yourself you'd make later. Pause for a second and reflect, because the smallest decisions often carry the biggest consequences. If this story feels real to you, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more stories that explore love, loss, and the lessons hidden in everyday life. Success had trained him to move fast. From the very beginning, speed had been rewarded in his life. Quick thinking, early decisions, acting before doubt could slow momentum. While others hesitated, he chose. While others waited for certainty, he accepted risk. And it worked. That, the most dangerous part. His early career had been defined by moments where hesitation would have ruined him. A deal signed just in time. An investment made before the market turned. A decision taken while others were still arguing about possibilities. Each time, speed had saved him. Each time, it reinforced a simple belief. Action is always better than waiting. Over time, that belief hardened into identity. He became known as someone who didn't overthink, someone decisive, someone reliable under pressure. People trusted him because he acted when others froze. They admired his confidence, mistaking decisiveness for certainty. He did, too. What he didn't realize was that speed, when applied everywhere, stops being a strength. In business, speed creates advantage. In relationships, speed often bypasses understanding. But no one had taught him that difference. Growing up, he had learned early that being useful mattered. He wasn't the loudest in the room or the most emotionally expressive, but he was dependable. When something needed fixing, he fixed it. When something needed solving, he solved it. Praise followed performance. Approval followed results. So he leaned into what worked. By the time he built his first real success, he had already learned the lesson life seemed eager to teach him. Emotions slow things down. Feelings complicate progress. Action gets results. That lesson carried him far. It also quietly shaped how he loved. At home, when problems surfaced, his instinct wasn't to sit with them. It was to neutralize them. If his wife sounded frustrated, he reassured her. If tension appeared, he smoothed it over. If emotions rose, he offered logic. He didn't ignore her feelings. He managed them. And management, he believed, was care. But emotional connection doesn't thrive on efficiency. It thrives on presence, something that can't be rushed or resolved on a timeline. He didn't know that to him, love was a structure already built, a foundation laid years ago through commitment and shared history. He believed it could endure long periods of neglect, the way a strong company could endure a temporary dip. He didn't see the difference between strain and damage. When his wife grew quieter, he interpreted it as acceptance. When his son stopped asking questions, he read it as independence. When the house felt calmer, he told himself things were improving. Silence, in his world, meant stability. What he didn't understand was that silence in relationships often means resignation. At work, if someone stopped offering ideas, it meant disengagement. It meant they had given up on being heard. He knew this. He acted on it swiftly, calling meetings, inviting feedback, restoring involvement. At home, he ignored the same signal. That contradiction lived quietly inside him, unchecked. The pressure of his role didn't help. Being at the top meant carrying responsibility no one else could see. Decisions affected livelihoods. One mistake could ripple outward. He told himself he needed rest from emotional demands, not more of them. So when someone appeared in his life who required nothing, no explanation, no accountability, no emotional processing, it felt like relief. He didn't see it as escape. He saw it as balance. That belief was reinforced every time he left a meeting exhausted and arrived somewhere he didn't have to be anything but present in the simplest way. No expectations, no unresolved history, no emotional debt. Just now. Ironically, that same now, the one he avoided at home, was the one he embraced elsewhere. Education rarely announces itself as a lesson. More often, it disguises itself as convenience. Life was trying to teach him something he wasn't ready to learn. What feels easy in the moment often becomes expensive later. But because nothing had collapsed yet, he assumed the cost would never come due. He told himself he was being careful, that he was protecting everyone from unnecessary conflict. That timing mattered, and the right moment would come. He didn't realize that waiting for the perfect moment is often how we avoid the necessary one. By the end of that year, his professional life was stronger than ever. His reputation was untouchable, his confidence solid, and his personal life, though quietly thinning, still appeared intact. From the outside, he looked like a man who had mastered time. From the inside, he was slowly losing it. Because speed had taught him how to win. Oh, what it had never taught him how to stay. And the lesson he was about to learn would cost him far more than anything speed had ever earned. Being needed had always felt like purpose. Early on, it gave his days shape. People depended on him. Outcomes changed because of him. When things went wrong, he was called. When things went right, he was credited. Need made him visible. It made him valuable. Over time, that feeling became addictive. He learned to measure his worth by how often others required him, how urgently, how consistently. If his phone rang late at night, it meant he mattered. If his calendar filled weeks in advance, it meant he was indispensable. The more pressure he carried, the more legitimate his exhaustion felt. At home, he carried that same logic without realizing it. He believed love should understand his absence because his absence was productive, that it should forgive missed moments because those moments were sacrificed for something important. He told himself he was doing it for them, even when it cost him with them. This belief was subtle, dangerous. It allowed him to feel virtuous while being unavailable. When his wife asked how long a trip would be, he answered with dates instead of reassurance. When she mentioned feeling lonely, he responded with logistics. When she said she missed him, he reminded her of what he was building. He wasn't dismissive. He was efficient. And efficiency, he believed, was a form of care. But emotional needs don't disappear when they're handled quickly. They deepen when they're handled poorly. His wife began to sense that there was no space left for her feelings to land. Every concern was met with a solution before it could be fully expressed. Every emotion was addressed before it could be understood. Eventually, she stopped bringing them. That shift didn't feel like conflict. It felt like peace. He mistook her quiet for contentment, her distance for maturity, her emotional withdrawal for strength. What he didn't understand was that strength, when unacknowledged, turns into detachment. Their thun adapted too. Children are careful observers. They learn what matters by watching what interrupts adults and what doesn't. He noticed which calls his father always took, which conversations could be postponed, which promises were flexible. At first, the boy competed for attention. He asked questions at inconvenient times. He lingered near doorways. He spoke quickly, as if afraid the opportunity to be heard might close. Eventually, he learned what not to ask. That education happened quietly. No lectures, no warnings, just repetition. And repetition teaches faster than words. At work, being needed had limits. He delegated. He trained others. He understood that sustainability required distribution. At home, he never learned that lesson. He believed being needed meant being important. He didn't realize that constantly being unavailable taught the people closest to him how to live without him. When the other woman entered his life, she did so without noise, without demands, without history. She didn't need him in the way others did. That absence of need felt like relief. He didn't have to explain himself. He didn't have to justify his schedule. He didn't have to be anything beyond present. In the simplest way, their time together existed outside responsibility, outside consequence. He told himself it wasn't a choice, that it was separate, that it didn't affect anything else. But separation is an illusion we maintain until it collapses. He didn't notice how his patience at home thinned, how conversations shortened, how emotional availability declined further. The contrast between effort required and effort avoided became more pronounced. Avoidance began to feel rational. He believed he was protecting everyone from strain. That confrontation would only make things worse. That timing mattered, and now wasn't the right time. But there is a lesson life teaches repeatedly, whether we listen or not. Avoidance doesn't reduce pain. It delays it and compounds it. His wife felt the accumulation before he did. She carried the unanswered questions, the unmet needs, the loneliness that came from sharing space without sharing life. She remembered everything, not because she wanted to hold on to the past, but because unresolved moments don't fade. They linger. They resurface in quiet hours and long nights. They become part of how we interpret love. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't explode. It clarified. The affair wasn't the beginning of her pain. It was confirmation of it. And that realization hurt more than betrayal ever could. For him, the moment came later. After the house emptied, after the routines broke, after success no longer felt sufficient to quiet the noise he'd ignored. He realized then that being needed had never been the problem. Being present was. He had confused importance with intimacy, demand with connection, visibility with love. Education often arrives, disguised as consequence. It doesn't explain itself. It simply shows you the result of what you chose not to learn earlier. He was beginning to understand something that would have changed everything if he'd learned it sooner. Being needed feels powerful. Being present feels vulnerable. And vulnerability is what he had been avoiding all along. The cost of that avoidance was now unavoidable. Because love doesn't ask us to be impressive. It asks us to be here. And by the time he recognized the difference, he had already taught the people he loved how to live without him. There had been a time when love didn't require effort, because effort felt natural. Back then, they didn't schedule conversations. They happened in the gaps between things, on the couch with the television muted, in the kitchen while something burned slightly on the stove, in bed when sleep refused to come. Words flowed easily, not because life was simple, but because attention was abundant. They talked about thing, ideas, fears, ridiculous plans that would never happen. He shared ambitions before they had names. She listened the way people do when they believe they are building something together, not just witnessing it. In those early years, memory was light, didn't carry weight. Yet, it wasn't a record of wounds or disappointments. It was a shared archive of beginnings. First apartments, late-night takeout, laughter that came from nothing at all. They learned each other's rhythms without effort. She knew when he needed quiet. He knew when she needed reassurance. Love, then, wasn't something they managed. It was something they inhabited. Even struggle felt connective. When money was tight, they worried together. When plans failed, they adjusted together. The future felt like a joint project, not a burden one of them carried alone. He remembered those years fondly, but vaguely. For him, they blurred together into a general sense of happiness, a background warmth he assumed would always exist. He didn't recall specific conversations or moments the way she did. He remembered outcomes, not details. She remembered everything else. The way he used to look up when she entered a room. The way he paused his work to listen. The way he once stayed up all night, helping her prepare for something that mattered only to her. Those memories became reference points, evidence of what love could look like when attention was freely given. As life grew more demanding, she noticed the change immediately. Not the big shifts, the small ones. He stopped asking follow-up questions. He responded while distracted. He listened with his body present, but his mind elsewhere. At first, she assumed it was temporary. Stress had seasons. Ambition required focus. She told herself this was normal, that relationships evolved, deepened, became quieter. But quiet had never meant empty before. She tried recreate closeness in subtle ways, suggesting shared routines, inviting conversation without framing it as a problem, offering space without withdrawing herself. He appreciated her patience without recognizing its cost. For him, the past existed as proof that things were fine. They had loved well once. That had to count for something. Shared history felt like insurance against distance. But love doesn't run on credit. She felt the imbalance grow, not in affection, but in attention. She was still noticing him. He had stopped noticing her noticing. That asymmetry mattered more than either of them realized. Memory began to change shape. For him, it became a shield, a reminder of who he believed himself to be as a partner, a way to reassure himself that nothing essential had been lost. For her, it became a mirror, reflecting what was missing now, by reminding her of what once existed. That difference would eventually separate them more than conflict ever could. Education often hides inside comparison. We learn what matters by noticing what's gone. She didn't accuse him changing. She didn't list grievances. She simply began to carry more of the relationship internally, remembering for both of them. And when one person becomes the sole keeper of memory, love begins to tilt. He didn't see the tilt. He felt stable. Stability, he would later learn, is not the same as connection. The foundation of their marriage wasn't cracked by betrayal or anger. It was worn down by assumption, the belief that love, once established, no longer needed to be actively chosen. That belief felt reasonable, comfortable, earned. It was also wrong, because love isn't sustained by how it begins. It's sustained by how often we return to it. And without realizing it, he had stopped returning, trusting memory to do the work presence once did. She remembered things he didn't, not because she was sentimental, but because memory had become her way of staying connected when presence began to thin. When attention faded, recollection stepped in to fill the gap. She remembered the night he promised her that no matter how big his life became, she would never have to compete with it. She remembered the exact tone of his voice when he said it. Not dramatic, not performative, but sincere. At the time, she believed him, without question. She remembered the first time she felt something shift. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't even a conversation. It was the moment she finished speaking and realized he hadn't heard her at all. His eyes were on her, his body turned toward her, but his mind was elsewhere. She had stopped mid-sentence, waiting for him to notice. He didn't. That moment stayed with her longer than it should have, not because it hurt deeply, but because it confused her. Didn't fit the story she had of them. So she made adjustments. She chose better timing, shorter sentences, less vulnerability. She learned to deliver emotions efficiently, the way he seemed to prefer. She believed that if she communicated more clearly, more calmly, more reasonably, she could meet him where he was. She didn't realize she was shrinking herself to fit into his availability. He noticed the change only as relief. Fewer heavy conversations, less tension, more peace. He told himself they had matured into something stable. He congratulated himself for building a life that no longer required constant emotional negotiation. What he didn't see was that peace had come at the cost of her voice. She began to carry conversations in her head instead of speaking them aloud. She rehearsed things she never said. She remembered moments he forgot, not to keep score, but to make sense of what she was feeling. Memory became her proof that she wasn't imagining the distance. When anniversaries passed with polite acknowledgments instead of intention, she remembered how they used to celebrate. When he asked how her day was while scrolling through his phone, she remembered when he used to sit beside her and listen without distraction. These comparisons weren't cruel. They were clarifying. They taught her something painful, but necessary. Love doesn't disappear suddenly. It recedes gradually, giving us time to notice, if we're willing to look. She tried one last time to bridge the gap. One evening, she asked him a simple question. Not an accusation, not a complaint. Do you still see me? He laughed softly, assuming reassurance was all that was required. Of course I do, but reassurance isn't the same as recognition. She didn't press the point. She nodded. She let the conversation move on. And in that moment, something inside her settled. Not in anger, but in understanding. She realized then that he remembered their marriage as something already secured, while she experienced it as something actively eroding. They were living in the same relationship, but remembering it differently. That difference mattered. Memory shapes interpretation. It determines how we understand love, rejection, and commitment. He interpreted her silence as acceptance. She experienced it as self-protection. He believed stability meant everything was fine. She knew stability without intimacy was just endurance. When the truth eventually surfaced, when the other woman stepped out of abstraction and into reality, it didn't shatter her world. It clarified it. The betrayal wasn't shocking, because she had already been grieving something long before it happened. What hurt most wasn't that he chose someone else. It was that he hadn't chosen her in a long time. When she said, "You don't see me anymore," she wasn't accusing him of infidelity. She was naming a truth she had been living with quietly for years. He tried to explain. Stress, pressure, timing. He spoke honestly, from his perspective. And in his mind, honesty should have counted for something. But honesty without awareness still misses the point. In his memory, he had been trying. In hers, he had been absent. Both were true, and neither canceled the other out. Education doesn't always come through instruction. Sometimes it arrives through contrast, through realizing that two people can experience the same years and walk away with entirely different understandings of what happened. That night, as she packed quietly, and their son watched from the hallway, she wasn't replaying the affair in her mind. She was replaying all the moments she had waited to be chosen, and hadn't been. When their son said, "You chose her," the sentence landed with a finality that couldn't be argued. Because from the outside, choices are measured by outcomes, not intentions. He understood that then. Too late to change it. Memory, he was learning, is not just about the past. It's about meaning. And the meaning she carried was clear. Love that isn't actively maintained becomes something we remember instead of something we live. By the time he recognized how much she had been holding on alone, she had already let go. Not in anger, but in acceptance. And that acceptance was irreversible. She entered his life quietly. No dramatic beginning, no secret meetings born out of impulse. Just a conversation that felt lighter than the ones he had been carrying for years. A space where he didn't have to explain himself before being understood. She listened. That alone felt extraordinary. She didn't interrupt to fix things. She didn't push for clarity or demand emotional precision. When he spoke, she didn't weigh his words against a history they shared. There was no past to navigate, no unresolved moments waiting in the background. With her, everything existed in the present. That immediacy felt like relief. He told himself that was the difference, that she accepted him as he was, while everything else in his life seemed to require adjustment, negotiation, patience. With her, he didn't feel behind. He didn't feel like he was constantly disappointing someone without knowing how. She never asked where he'd been emotionally. She never asked where things were going. She never asked for more than he was already willing to give. And because she asked for nothing, he told himself it cost nothing. This is how rationalization works. It disguises escape as balance. He didn't frame it as a choice. In his mind, he wasn't choosing her over his family. He was choosing peace for himself. He believed he could compartmentalize, keep things contained, maintain control. Control had always been his strength, but control in emotional life doesn't eliminate consequence. It delays it. With her, silence didn't feel like distance. It felt like calm. He could sit without speaking and not feel the pressure to fill the space. He could leave without explanation and return without consequence. That absence of accountability felt freeing. What he didn't recognize was that accountability is not punishment. It's proof of connection. At home, accountability had come in the form of memory, questions, expectations, shared history. Those things had begun to feel heavy to him, not because they were unreasonable, but because they required presence. Here, presence was optional. He didn't notice how his tolerance for discomfort decreased, how conversations that required effort began to feel intrusive, how he grew impatient with emotions that couldn't be resolved quickly. Comfort was quietly reshaping his standards. Education often comes disguised as relief. Life was teaching him something subtle and dangerous. When comfort is detached from responsibility, it slowly rewires what we believe we deserve. He began to spend more time where he wasn't challenged, where he wasn't reminded of what he hadn't done, where his absence didn't register as loss. Meanwhile, at home, the distance grew perceptible. His wife noticed his attention thinning even further. The way he checked his phone more often, the way his mind seemed elsewhere, even when his body was present. She didn't accuse. She observed. Observation, when repeated, becomes understanding. She stopped expecting him to notice the shift. She began preparing herself for the possibility that he never would. Their son felt it too. Children sense emotional rearrangements, even when no one names them. He couldn't articulate what had changed, only that something felt less secure, less anchored. He asked fewer questions, spent more time alone, learned to self-regulate. That learning wasn't age-appropriate, but it was necessary. Meanwhile, he told himself he was managing everything, that nothing essential was being lost, that this phase would pass once things settled. But comfort doesn't release us easily once it teaches us how little effort we can get away with. The woman who asked for nothing didn't see herself as taking anything. And in a narrow sense, she wasn't. She wasn't stealing time or making demands. But time given elsewhere is time not given here. Attention spent without accountability reshapes attachment. That is one of life's quiet lessons. What feels like rest can actually be retreat, and retreat, when repeated, becomes abandonment, even if no one intended it that way. He didn't see the damage yet. Everything still felt manageable, contained, quiet, but the absence of conflict was not the absence of cost. It was simply the calm before consequence. Silence didn't arrive suddenly. It settled in slowly, the way dust does, thin layers at a time, unnoticed until everything feels dimmer. At first, silence felt like mercy. It spared him explanations. It spared him conflict. It spared him the discomfort of sitting with emotions he didn't know how to resolve. In silence, nothing demanded a response. Nothing insisted on being felt all the way through. He told himself that honesty would only make things worse, that speaking up would create pain where there was still a chance for calm. He believed restraint was wisdom, that holding back was a form of protection. Protection for everyone. But silence doesn't protect relationships. It protects avoidance. He avoided naming what he was doing, because naming would force a reckoning. Words have a way of making choices real. As long as things remained unspoken, they felt reversible, temporary, flexible, not yet final. Silence kept options open. At home, he answered questions with fewer words. He shared less of his inner life. He learned how to be physically present without being emotionally available. He believed this was maturity, the ability to remain steady, unreactive, controlled. His wife felt the difference immediately. Honesty, when it disappears, leaves behind a specific kind of emptiness. No loud, not dramatic, just hollow. Conversations lose their shape. Words stop carrying weight. What's left feels transactional, necessary information exchanged without intimacy. She began to sense that he was no longer speaking with her, but around her. She asked herself questions she never imagined having to ask. Was she asking for too much? Was this just what long marriages became? Was she failing to appreciate what she had? She searched her own behavior for flaws before questioning his absence. That, too, was a kind of silence, self-directed, internal, exhausting. Meanwhile, he experienced her quiet as relief. No arguments, no demands, no emotional negotiations at the end of long days. He mistook her withdrawal for understanding, her restraint for acceptance. He didn't realize she was learning how to live without his participation. Their son watched the shift without words. Children don't need explanations to feel instability. They sense it in tone, in timing, in the way adults stop laughing at the same things. He noticed how his parents' conversations shortened, how silence replaced ease. He learned to make himself smaller. That learning happened without instruction, without intention, just observation. He learned which moments were safe to speak and which were not. He learned that emotional bids were risky, that they might be met with distraction, delay, or polite dismissal. So he stopped offering them. That was the education he received. Love is something you don't interrupt. The woman in the other apartment never asked him to be honest about what he was avoiding. She didn't press him to explain the weight he carried or the distance he was creating elsewhere. Her silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was permissive. It allowed him to remain exactly as he was. That permissiveness felt like kindness. But kindness without truth is comfort, not care. He didn't see it at that nay yet. To him, honesty felt dangerous. It threatened the fragile balance he believed he was maintaining. Silence felt safer because it preserved the illusion that nothing had to change. But illusions are expensive. They demand constant upkeep. They require energy to maintain. And the longer they're sustained, the more painful their collapse becomes. The moment everything surfaced wasn't explosive. It was quiet. His wife didn't shout. She didn't cry. She didn't demand explanations. She simply named what she had already come to understand. I don't feel like I exist to you anymore, she said. The sentence was calm, measured, certain. He tried to respond with logic, with context, with pressure, with reasons that made sense to him. He spoke honestly, from his perspective. And in doing so, he missed the point entirely. Honesty isn't just saying what you think. It's recognizing what the other person feels. She didn't need explanations. She needed recognition. When she said, "You don't see me anymore," she wasn't asking for reassurance. She was stating a fact. That was the moment silence lost its usefulness. Because once truth is spoken clearly, avoidance no longer looks neutral. It looks like choice. She packed quietly that night, folded clothes with care, left things behind without comment. Their son stood in the hallway, absorbing the scene with the quiet attention of someone who would remember it later. No one argued. Arguments, after all, require belief that something can still be resolved. When their son spoke, "You chose her," the sentence landed without cruelty. It didn't accuse, it observed. In that moment, he understood something silence had allowed him to avoid for too long. Not choosing is still choosing. Every unspoken truth, every postponed conversation, every moment, honesty felt inconvenient. They had all led here. Education doesn't always come with warning. Sometimes it arrives fully formed, carrying the consequences of everything we refused to address earlier. Silence had felt safer than honesty, because honesty would have required him to change. And change, unlike silence, demands courage. By the time he understood that truth, the silence he had relied on was no longer protecting him. It was standing as evidence of what he had lost. The truth didn't arrive the way people imagine it does. There was no shouting, no confrontation staged at the perfect moment, no evidence dramatically revealed. It came quietly, almost gently, through a realization that had been forming for a long time. She noticed it in the pauses first. The way he stopped reacting when she entered a room. The way his phone seemed to matter more than the conversation unfolding in front of him. The way his attention drifted, even when nothing demanded it. Attention, she had learned, leaves fingerprints. She didn't search for proof. She didn't need to. The emotional absence had already told her everything she needed to know. When the confirmation came, indirect, understated, it felt less like shock and more like completion. A puzzle piece finally locking into place. She sat at the kitchen table alone that evening, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold, and replayed the last few years in her mind. Not with bitterness, with clarity. She remembered how often she had waited, how many conversations she had postponed, how frequently she had accepted less than she needed in order to keep the peace. The affair didn't rewrite their story. It explained it. When she spoke to him about it, her voice was steady. "I know," she said. "That was all." He froze, not because he was caught, but because he realized she had already moved past the need for explanation. He tried to speak, to frame it carefully, to soften the impact with context and intention. She stopped him gently. "This isn't about her," she said. "It's about how long I've been alone while standing next to you." That sentence changed everything. He realized then that betrayal wasn't the deepest wound. Neglect was. The affair hadn't broken the marriage. It had revealed how fragile it already was. She wasn't angry. Anger still implies hope. She was clear. Clarity doesn't shout. It concludes. She told him she was leaving. Not dramatically. Not in haste. She had already considered the logistics. She had already spoken to herself in the quiet hours and decided what she could no longer accept. Their son watched from the hallway again. Older now. More aware. He didn't cry. He didn't ask questions. He observed. Children learn in moments like these, not through words, but through tone, through what adults choose to model under pressure. Later that night, after the house emptied and the silence changed shape, he sat alone and tried to locate the moment where he could have acted differently. There too many. That was the lesson. Disasters that don't announce themselves are built slowly, choice by choice, omission by omission. By the time the truth surfaces, the damage has already been done. Not suddenly, but thoroughly. Education often comes wrapped in consequence. He was beginning to understand something painful and precise. Love rarely ends because of one unforgivable act. It ends because too many forgivable ones go unaddressed. And now, standing in the quiet aftermath, he had to face the truth that required no shouting at all. He hadn't lost his family in a single moment. He had lost them in all the moments he chose not to be fully present. After she left, the house felt unfamiliar. Not empty, but rearranged, as if the walls themselves were trying to understand what had changed. He walked from room to room, touching things without knowing why. The back of a chair, the edge of the counter, the light switch near the hallway that still worked only if pressed just right. Objects carried memory better than people sometimes. They remembered how to be used, even when the people who gave them meaning were gone. That night, he sat alone and replayed the years as he remembered them. In his version, he had been trying to build something stable, trying to protect his family from stress, trying to carry responsibility without letting it spill into their lives. He remembered himself as present when it mattered, supportive when asked, faithful in the ways that counted most to him. He remembered providing. He remembered staying. He remembered loving, quietly, steadily, imperfectly. In her version, the same years looked very different. She remembered waiting, waiting for attention that never fully arrived, waiting for conversations that were always postponed, waiting for recognition that came too late or not at all. She remembered standing beside him while slowly becoming invisible. Neither version was a lie. That was the most unsettling part. Memory isn't a recording, it's an interpretation. It preserves what we focus on and edits what we minimize. He focused on intention. She focused on experience, and experience carries more weight. When he thought about the past, he saw effort. When she thought about it, she felt loneliness. When he recalled long workdays, he felt justified. When she recalled them, she felt abandoned. Two people can share a life and still live inside completely different emotional histories. That realization unsettled him more than guilt ever had. He reached for his phone instinctively, then stopped. There was no one to reassure him now, no one to soften the truth with understanding. The silence he had relied on had turned against him. For the first time, he allowed himself to ask a question he had avoided for years. What if I was wrong? Not wrong in intent, wrong in approach. What if love wasn't something you secured early and maintained through duty? What if it required constant, visible choice? Education often begins with humility. Over the following weeks, he moved into a smaller apartment. The change felt symbolic. Less space to avoid himself, fewer rooms to retreat into. The business continued to thrive. Headlines praised his focus, his resilience, his ability to compartmentalize personal matters without losing momentum. From the outside, he looked untouched. Inside, he was unraveling quietly. At night, he scrolled through old photos, his wife laughing at the beach, their son asleep against his shoulder, moments frozen in time that now felt like evidence he no longer knew how to interpret. He told himself these photos proved he had loved well. But proof without continuity is just nostalgia. Love doesn't live in evidence. It lives in presence. The call from his wife came on a Tuesday afternoon. I need you to pick him up on Friday, she said. I'll be out of town. Of course, he replied. There was a pause. He doesn't talk much these days, she added. If you're expecting things to be normal, I understand, he said. But he didn't. Not yet. That Friday evening, his son slid into the passenger seat, taller now, quieter. The boy stared out the window as the city passed by, familiar landmarks blurring into one another. They drove without speaking for several minutes. He wanted to say something meaningful, something restorative. Instead, he asked the only thing that felt safe. You hungry? A shrug. They stopped at a diner. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades. Families sat nearby, conversations overlapping in a low, comforting hum. As they waited for their food, he noticed his son tracing patterns on the table with his finger. A nervous habit from childhood, one he used to correct without thinking. This time, he let it be. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said quietly. His son looked up, surprised. Not angry, just tired. "I know." The simplicity of the response hit harder than accusation ever could. "But knowing doesn't make it easier," the boy continued. "You weren't there. Not really. And now it feels like you chose the part of your life that asked the least of you." He had rehearsed explanations for this moment. Stress, responsibility, fear, they all crowded his mind, eager to be deployed. He didn't use them. "I was afraid," he admitted, "of failing, of being needed and getting it wrong." His son studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "I get that." They ate in silence after that, not awkward, just careful. Something fragile passed between them. Not forgiveness, not resolution, recognition. That night, alone in his apartment, he sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the city breathe outside his window. For the first time, he didn't distract himself. He didn't reach for comfort. He let the weight of the moment settle fully. Two versions of the past had led them here. And if the future was going to look any different, it would require a new way of choosing, not based on comfort or intention, but on presence. That understanding didn't fix anything, but it finally told him where to begin. Sometimes the truth doesn't hurt because it's loud. It hurts because it explains everything. If this chapter reminded you of a moment where intention didn't match impact, or a relationship where two people remembered the same past differently, take a moment to reflect. If stories like this help you see life more clearly, like the video, share it with someone who needs perspective, and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more stories that reveal the real consequences of our choices. Children don't need explanations to understand distance. They feel it long before they can name it. His son had felt it for years. At first, it showed up as confusion. The boy would wait at the top of the stairs, listening for footsteps that didn't come. He would start sentences that trailed off halfway through, unsure whether the moment was right. He learned to read tone, posture, timing, skills children shouldn't have to master so early. He learned when not to interrupt. That lesson arrived quietly. If his father was on the phone, the boy waited. If his father looked tired, he waited. If his father said later, he waited, sometimes for hours, sometimes indefinitely. Waiting became normal, expected, safe. No one told him to do this. He watched and adjusted. That is how children learn love, not through speeches, but through patterns. When his father did show up, it felt conditional, earned, something that required good behavior, efficiency, or silence. The boy noticed that enthusiasm wasn't always welcomed, that curiosity sometimes felt like an inconvenience. So he learned to compress himself. He spoke less, asked fewer questions, shared what felt necessary. He grew independent early, not because he wanted to, but because independence reduced disappointment. Adults often mistake this for maturity. It isn't. It's adaptation. He loved his father. That never disappeared, but love changed shape when it wasn't consistently met. Became careful, observant, guarded. He learned to rely on his mother's memory. Instead, she remembered things, birthdays, small preferences, passing comments made weeks earlier. With her, continuity existed. With her, the world felt held together. And children notice that, too. They learn where safety lives. When the house finally split, the boy didn't ask why. He already knew. He had been collecting evidence for years. Adults assume children miss things. Children assume adults don't notice. Both are wrong. The boy remembered the night his father missed a school event, not because of an emergency, but because something else came up. The explanation had sounded reasonable, calm, logical, but reason doesn't soften absence. He remembered watching other parents clap, other fathers lean forward in their seats. He remembered pretending not to care. That pretending became another skill. After the separation, the boy grew quieter still, not withdrawn, controlled. He chose words carefully. He observed reactions before speaking. He didn't expect much, which protected him from disappointment. That protection came at a cost. He didn't ask his father for help with small things anymore. He didn't bring problems unless they were unavoidable. He learned to solve what he could alone. That learning looked like strength, but strength learned too early often masks grief. When his father finally picked him up that Friday evening, the boy noticed the difference immediately. The hesitation, the way his father seemed unsure what to say. Adults think children don't sense uncertainty. They do. In the car, the boy kept his headphones on, not to block out sound, but to control the interaction. Music gave him an excuse not to talk. Silence felt safer than risking misunderstanding. At the diner, when his father spoke honestly for the first time, not defensively, not efficiently, but vulnerably, the boy felt something unfamiliar. Relief, not because the pain disappeared, but because it was finally acknowledged. When his father said he had been afraid, the boy didn't feel responsible for that fear. He simply recognized it. Fear made sense. Fear explained things. Understanding doesn't heal everything, but it opens the door. That was the first moment the boy saw his father differently, not as someone distant, but as someone human. That mattered because children don't need perfect parents. They need parents who are real. After that night, the boy began watching again, but differently. He noticed when his father showed up unexpectedly, when he listened without correcting, when he stayed longer than necessary. These moments were small, almost invisible, But small moments are what children trust. He didn't rush to Vava. Children don't. They wait to see patterns. Consistency matters more than apology. One afternoon, his father came to the school to drop off a forgotten form. The boy noticed. He didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't smile widely, but he remembered. Memory was forming again, this time with new material. Education, the kind that shapes us for life, rarely comes through instruction. It comes through example. The boy was learning something new now, that adults can change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but through repeated action. And the father was learning something just as important, that the version of himself his son would carry forward was still being written, not by what he promised, not by what he explained, but by what he did, again and again, when it mattered. Children learn love by observation, and for the first time in a long while, he understood the weight of being watched, not with judgment, but with hope. The sentence had been waiting for a long time. Didn't arrive in anger. It wasn't thrown like a weapon. It came the way truths often do. Quiet, direct, unavoidable. They were standing in the hallway that night, the house half-packed, boxes stacked neatly along the wall. The boy leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, not defensive, just steady. He had been watching his mother move from room to room with practiced calm. He had been watching his father stand uncertainly, unsure where to place himself in a space that no longer felt like his. "You chose her," the boy said. That was all. No accusation followed. No explanation. The sentence didn't need one. For a moment, his father didn't respond. He opened his mouth, ready to correct the misunderstanding, to explain nuance, intention, complexity, to say it wasn't that simple. But the boy's eyes didn't waver. Children see outcomes, not explanations. From where the boy stood, the pattern was clear. His father had been absent long before anyone left. He had chosen where his attention went. He had chosen where his comfort lived. He had chosen silence over presence again and again. Choice, to a child, isn't philosophical. It's practical. You're either there or you're not. The boy didn't need to hear about pressure or responsibility or fear. Those were adult concepts, built to explain behavior after the fact. What mattered to him was what he had lived through. Missed moments, shortened conversations, the slow realization that his father's attention was something to be earned or postponed. When his father finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "I didn't mean to," he said. The boy nodded once. He wasn't dismissing the words. He simply wasn't moved by them. "I know," he replied, "but that's what happened." That distinction mattered. Intent explained behavior. Impact defined it. They stood there for a few seconds longer, the house holding its breath around them. Then the boy turned and went back to his room, closing the door behind him. Not angrily, not dramatically, just decisively. That night, his father sat alone in the living room and replayed the sentence again and again. You chose her. He realized then that children don't experience betrayal the same way adults do. They don't feel replaced. They feel deprioritized. They learn that love competes with other things and sometimes loses. That lesson stays. In the weeks that followed, the boy didn't bring the sentence up again. He didn't need to. He let his behavior speak. Instead, he stayed polite, cooperative, distant in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. He didn't ask his father to attend events anymore. He informed him neutrally, without expectation. He didn't complain when plans changed. He adjusted. Adjustment had become second nature. His father noticed these things now. Each one landed with a quiet sting. Not dramatic pain, but cumulative weight. This was the consequence he hadn't anticipated. Not anger, not rebellion, but emotional self-sufficiency. Children who stop needing you, stop asking for you. That truth frightened him more than conflict ever could. He began to understand that the boy wasn't punishing him. He was protecting himself. He was maintaining emotional balance the only way he knew how, by limiting expectation. Education doesn't always come from mistakes. Sometimes it comes from witnessing their effect on someone else. One evening, as they sat together watching television, the boy reached for the remote without asking and changed the channel. It was a small thing, insignificant on the surface, but his father noticed what wasn't there. There was no glance to check for approval, no pause to see if it was okay. The boy had stopped orienting himself around his father's presence. That was the cost of absence. Later that night, lying awake, his father finally admitted something he had resisted for years. Being chosen matters most to the people who can't choose alternatives. Children don't have other relationships to retreat into. They don't have distractions that fully replace loss. When a parent disengages, the child absorbs the gap. And absorption leaves marks. He couldn't undo what had been learned, but he could influence what came next. The next morning, he showed up somewhere he usually wouldn't have. Not because it was convenient. Not because it made sense professionally. Because it mattered. The boy noticed. He didn't comment. He didn't smile widely. He simply observed. Observation, after all, was how he learned everything. And this time, what he observed was different. The sentence, "You chose her," didn't disappear. It remained true, but no longer stood alone. It now sat beside something else, evidence that choice could be made again, differently, even after damage. That realization didn't heal the boy overnight. Healing doesn't work that way, but it softened something. And for the first time, the father understood that repairing trust wasn't about proving love. It was about demonstrating priority, quietly, repeatedly, without expectation of reward. Children don't need to hear that you choose them. They need to see it. From the outside, nothing had changed. If anything, his life looked sharper, more focused, more efficient. The separation seemed to free up time. The emotional noise quieted. His schedule tightened. His work accelerated. Investors praised his clarity. Colleagues admired his composure. Articles described him as disciplined, resilient, unaffected by personal distraction. They called it strength. What they couldn't see was how silence had simply moved locations. At work, he spoke with authority. At home, he spoke carefully, or not at all. In meetings, his words shaped outcomes. In his personal life, words felt fragile, dangerous, inadequate. He learned quickly that success can function like anesthesia. Applause dulls discomfort. Achievement numbs regret. As long as results kept coming, there was no reason, externally, to slow down and examine what had been lost. So he didn't. He told himself he was doing the responsible thing, that maintaining momentum was necessary, that the best way forward was forward. Forward without reflection is just running. At night, his apartment felt orderly, but unfinished. No photos on the walls, no clutter, no history demanding attention. He told himself this was temporary, a transitional phase. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when no one interrupts it. He began filling the empty hours with productivity. Late workouts, early mornings, long stretches of uninterrupted work. Efficiency became his refuge. It worked until it didn't. One evening, after closing a deal that should have felt triumphant, he sat alone in his car and noticed something unsettling. The win felt flat. Not disappointing, just empty. He waited for satisfaction to arrive, the way it always had before. It didn't. The moment passed without registering as anything more than confirmation that things still functioned. He drove home in silence, the city lights blurring past, and realized that success no longer distracted him the way it used to. The numbness had deepened. Education rarely arrives when we're busy. It waits for the pause we avoid. He tried reaching out to his son more often, not dramatically, not insistently. Invitations, check-ins, all you. Sometimes they were accepted. Often they weren't. The boy remained polite, responsive, distant. That distance wasn't punishment. It was calibration. Trust recalibrates slowly. Children don't rush it. He noticed how his son asked fewer follow-up questions now. How conversations ended sooner. How silence returned more quickly than it should have. He understood then that showing up once doesn't undo years of absence. Consistency had to replace intensity. That lesson applied everywhere, not just at home. At work, one successful decision built credibility. In relationships, credibility required repetition. He had spent years mistaking the two. The woman who once offered comfort without cost faded from his life gradually, not because of confrontation or closure, but because the ease she provided no longer soothed him. Comfort without accountability stopped feeling peaceful once he understood its price. He didn't miss her. He missed how uncomplicated everything felt before consequence arrived. That distinction mattered. One afternoon, he passed the old house by accident. The lights were on in the living room. He imagined his son inside, doing homework at the table. Imagined his wife moving through familiar rooms with new rhythms. He didn't stop, not because he didn't care, but because he finally understood that caring didn't grant access. Access had to be earned again. That realization marked a shift. Not dramatic, not visible, but internal. For the first time, success felt insufficient on its own. Not meaningless, but incomplete. He began to ask questions he'd never needed to ask before. What does it mean to win if no one celebrates with you? What does leadership matter if you fail the people closest to you? What does achievement offer when it no longer distracts from regret? Those questions didn't have quick answers. They resisted efficiency. They demanded reflection. And reflection was something he had avoided for years. Publicly, he continued to rise. Privately, he was learning something that success alone had never taught him. You can be admired by many and still be trusted by none. That lesson didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with quiet, and once noticed, it couldn't be ignored. At night, when the city quieted just enough to let thoughts surface, he found himself scrolling through old photos on his phone. He hadn't planned to. It happened automatically. Thumb moving, screen lighting his face, memory arranged neatly into squares and smiles. There they were. Beach trips, birthday candles. A much younger version of his son, asleep against his shoulder, mouth open, trust absolute. His wife laughing at something just outside the frame, unaware she was being captured. The images felt like evidence. See? He told himself. I was there. I loved them. I did my part. But evidence without continuity is misleading. Love doesn't exist in snapshots. It exists in patterns. He lingered on one photo longer than the others. A candid shot from years earlier, taken on an ordinary afternoon. No celebration, no milestone, just the three of them, sitting close together, comfortable in their closeness. That what he missed most. Not the big moments, but the unremarkable ones, the daily proof that presence was mutual and unforced. He realized then that he had been trying to use the past as currency, as if earlier effort could compensate for later absence, as if love accrued interest simply by existing long enough. But relationships don't operate that way. Love doesn't work retroactively. You can't show up late and expect the earlier connection to cover the gap. You can't point to history and ask it to do the work of present attention. That understanding stung because it reframed everything he had relied on. His wife had never denied the past. She had honored it carefully, carrying it forward when he stopped doing so. But she hadn't mistaken it for proof that things were still alive. He had. For him, the past was reassurance. For her, it was contrast. That difference explained so much. The more he reflected, the clearer the pattern became. He hadn't been cruel. He hadn't been careless in the way people imagine. He had simply assumed that love, once established, could survive neglect indefinitely. It couldn't. One afternoon, while waiting outside his son's school, he watched parents greet their children, some with excitement, some with exhaustion, some with irritation. None of it looked perfect. All of it looked real. He wondered how many of them assumed there would always be time to show up later. Time is patient until it isn't. His son emerged from the building, scanning the crowd. When he spotted him, there was a brief hesitation, then a nod, a small acknowledgement, not avoidance, not enthusiasm. Honest, they drove together in quiet. The silence wasn't hostile anymore. It was cautious. "Did you ever think I didn't love you?" he asked suddenly, surprising even himself. His thought for a moment. "No," he said. "I just didn't think you noticed when I needed you." That answer stayed with him. Love, he realized, isn't measured by feeling. It's measured by responsiveness. At work, responsiveness had always been his strength. He addressed problems quickly. He noticed shifts before they became crises. He understood that delay increased cost. In his personal life, he had ignored the same principle. The education felt brutal in its simplicity. He began to see how often he had waited for certainty before acting emotionally, how often he had postponed difficult conversations until they felt safer, until the right moment arrived. But the right moment rarely announces itself. It passes quietly while we prepare. That night, back in his apartment, he closed the photo app and set his phone aside. He didn't want reassurance anymore. He wanted alignment. He wanted his actions to match the meaning he claimed to value. That wouldn't restore what had been lost. He knew that now. Some things don't rewind. Some trust doesn't reset. But presence, he was learning, doesn't require guarantees. It requires choice, repeatedly, in real time, without the promise of immediate reward. That was the hardest lesson of all. Because love that works retroactively doesn't exist. Love only works now. And if he was going to become someone worth trusting again, it wouldn't be through reminders of who he used to be, but through evidence of who he was willing to be, starting here, starting small, starting immediately. The diner hadn't changed in years. The same cracked vinyl booths, the same laminated menus with corners that refused to lie flat. The same bell above the door that rang every time someone came in, announcing arrivals without ceremony. It was the kind of place where conversations didn't have to be important to matter. They sat across from each other, a narrow table between them, a space that felt symbolic in ways neither of them named. His son rested his elbows lightly on the surface, fingers tracing invisible patterns, eyes scanning the room as if cataloging exits. Silence settled in. Not the heavy kind. Not the awkward kind. The careful kind. He noticed it immediately, the way his son didn't rush to fill it. Didn't glance up for reassurance. Didn't seem uncomfortable letting the moment exist on its own. This silence wasn't emptiness. It was caution. Silence learned. The waitress came and went. Orders were placed, without much discussion. Coffee arrived, steaming, untouched. He wanted to say something meaningful, something that would signal awareness, growth, remorse. He felt the familiar urge to solve, to compress years of absence into a single, effective sentence. He resisted it. This time, he waited. Education had taught him something already. Silence can be an invitation, if you let it be. His son spoke first. "They don't make places like this anymore," the boy said, almost casually. He nodded. "Yeah? Some things don't change much." Another pause. "Most things do," his son replied. The statement wasn't confrontational. It was observational, a fact, not an accusation. He felt it anyway. He watched his son carefully now, noticing what he used to miss. The guarded posture, the way words were chosen deliberately, the way eye contact came and went like a negotiation. Children don't dramatize pain. They manage it. That management had become his son's default. He remembered all the times he had filled silence with efficiency, answers instead of understanding, reassurance instead of curiosity. He had treated quiet as a problem to be fixed. Now he let it be. "I wasn't good at noticing when you needed me," he said finally. The words came out slower than he was used to. Heidi, unpolished. His son didn't respond right away. He took a sip of water, considered something, then nodded slightly. "That's true," he said. No anger, no relief, just accuracy. Silence returned. But it felt different now. Less defensive, more open. The kind that allowed truth to sit between them without being pushed away. He realized then that his son wasn't waiting for an apology. He was waiting for consistency. The waitress returned with their food. Plates were set down. Ketchup slid across the table. Ordinary movements resumed. Life uninterrupted. As they ate, he noticed something small, but telling. His son didn't rush. He stayed. He didn't glance at the door or his phone. He remained in the moment, cautiously present. That felt like permission. "I don't need you to be perfect," his son said quietly, eyes still on his plate. "I just don't want to feel like I'm interrupting your life." The sentence landed with precision. He understood now what silence had been teaching his son all these years. When attention feels conditional, you learn to minimize yourself. "I don't want that either," he said. "I know words won't fix it." His son looked up then, really looked. "Show me," he said. 2 words. No emotion attached. No timeline offered. Just a standard. Silence followed again. But this time, it wasn't cautious. It was shared. He understood then that this conversation wasn't about resolution. It was about orientation, about choosing how to move forward without pretending the past could be erased. Silence, he was learning, speaks louder than promises. It reveals patience. It reveals restraint. It reveals whether someone is willing to stay without controlling the outcome. As they finished their meal and stood to leave, he noticed something else. His son waited for him, not out of obligation, not automatically, but because he chose to. That choice was small, almost invisible, but it mattered because it meant the silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a bridge, unfinished, fragile, but finally pointing somewhere forward. They paid at the counter, the bell above the door chiming softly as they stepped back into the evening. The air outside was cool, the kind that sharpened your senses without feeling harsh. Cars passed on the road, headlights sweeping briefly across their faces before moving on. They walked side by side toward the car. Not close, not far. That careful distance again. Measured, intentional. He unlocked the doors, then hesitated before getting in. It wasn't a dramatic pause, just long enough to consider something he might once have rushed past. "I'm glad you came," he said. His son nodded. "Me too." They drove for a few minutes in silence. The city sliding by outside the windows. Traffic lights turned red, then green. Ordinary movement, ordinary time. Then his son spoke. "You know," he said, eyes still forward, "I think the hardest part wasn't that you were gone." The sentence caught him off guard. It was that when you were around, I never knew if you really were. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, not in tension, but in recognition. "That messes with you," his son continued. "You start wondering if you're asking for too much, or if you're just bad at timing." The words landed slowly, deliberately, like stones placed one by one. He had expected anger. He had prepared for resentment. He hadn't prepared for this kind of clarity. "That's on me," he said quietly. His son glanced over, surprised, not by the admission, but by how simply it was offered. "It doesn't mean you're a bad person," the boy said after a moment. "Joe, distracted." Distracted. The word echoed in his mind. He had spent years thinking of distraction as something external. Emails, calls, pressure, responsibility. He had never considered that distraction could be a choice. That was the sentence that changed him, not because it condemned him, but because it explained everything. He had been present physically, successful professionally, consistent logistically, but emotionally distracted. And distraction, he now understood, is a form of absence that doesn't look like abandonment until it's already done its work. They pulled into the driveway of the old house. Lights glowed softly inside. The front porch looked the same as it always had. He turned off the engine. "I don't want to be distracted anymore," he said. "Not with you." His son didn't respond immediately. He unbuckled his seatbelt, then paused. "I'll believe that when I see it," he said. Not unkindly, not harshly, just honestly. He nodded. "That's fair." The boy got out of the car, slung his backpack over one shoulder, then stopped and turned back. "Thanks for dinner," he said. 2 ordinary words, but they felt earned. That night, alone again, he didn't replay the conversation looking for what he could have said better. He didn't analyze it for efficiency. He let it be what it was, a moment of truth, exchanged without defense. He sat at the edge of his bed and thought about the word distracted. How many moments had passed while his attention was elsewhere? How many connections weakened because he assumed he would notice when it mattered? He realized then that distraction wasn't neutral, wasn't harmless. It taught people what to expect from you. And once expectations adjust downward, raising them again takes time. Education doesn't always arrive with urgency. Sometimes it arrives with precision, naming the exact flaw we can no longer ignore. He stood and walked into the kitchen. The drawer that stuck halfway closed caught his attention. He opened it fully, adjusted the track, and pushed it back in. It slid smoothly. A small fix. Immediate. Remarkable. He smiled faintly. The clock on the wall ticked evenly now, second after second, steady and indifferent. Time wasn't waiting for him. It never had, but he was done waiting on himself. From that night forward, he began practicing something unfamiliar, acting in the moment. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but intentionally. And that, he was finally learning, was where real change began. Change didn't arrive with momentum. It arrived with interruption. The first interruption came on a Tuesday morning, ordinary in every way. His calendar was full. His phone buzzed with messages marked urgent. A meeting had been moved up, pulling everything else tighter around it. Then another notification appeared, one he used to treat as flexible. A reminder about his son's school event that afternoon. For years, this was where the calculation would have happened. What could be postponed? What could be delegated? What could be excused? He had always believed he was choosing the greater good. This time, he stopped. He closed his calendar and stared at the reminder until it felt heavier than the meetings stacked above it. The old instinct pushed back. You can make it next time. This isn't critical. He'll understand. That voice sounded familiar now. Too familiar. He forwarded the meeting to someone else with a brief note, grabbed his jacket, and left without overthinking it. No announcement. No justification. Just action. At the school, he arrived early enough to wait. Parents gathered in small groups, talking quietly, scrolling through phones, watching doors. He stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, feeling oddly exposed. When his son emerged and saw him, there was a pause. Not surprise, not excitement. Assessment, then a nod. That nod stayed with him longer than any praise ever had. They sat through the event together. Nothing remarkable happened. No spotlight. No emotional breakthrough. Just shared presence. Shared time. That was the point. On the drive home, his son talked a little more than usual. Not about anything important, just details. A classmate, a project, a joke that didn't quite land. He listened without steering the conversation, without multitasking, without trying to turn it into a moment. Later that night, alone in his apartment, the quiet felt different, less hollow, less accusatory. He realized something unsettling and hopeful at the same time. Showing up hadn't fixed anything, but it had changed the direction. Over the following weeks, he practiced interruption deliberately. When a call came during dinner, he let it go to voicemail. When a conversation grew uncomfortable, he stayed instead of escaping. When he felt the urge to explain, he listened instead. None of it felt natural. Presence, he learned, is a skill, not a personality trait. There were setbacks. Days he reverted to old habits. Moments he noticed too late that his attention had drifted. He corrected himself without drama and moved on. Perfection wasn't the goal. Consistency was. One Saturday morning, his son asked for help with a project. Cardboard, markers, instructions neither of them fully understood. They worked at the kitchen table, hands occasionally bumping, tape sticking where it shouldn't. At one point, his son looked up and said, "You don't have to stay if you're busy." The sentence carried no accusation, just a check. "I'm not," he said. Then, after a pause, "And even if I was, I'd rather be here." The words felt risky, unprotected. His son nodded and went back to work. That night, he returned to the old house to pick up a few things. The kitchen was quiet, exactly as he remembered. The clock on the wall ticked evenly, steady now. He remembered the morning he had finally fixed it, how small the act had felt, how symbolic it had been. At the time, he hadn't trusted it to mean anything. Now he understood. Fixing the clock hadn't changed time. It had changed him. He no longer told himself he would act later. He acted when the moment presented itself, even when it was inconvenient, especially when it was uncomfortable. That didn't erase the past. Nothing could. But it stopped the damage from spreading. Education rarely feels like mastery. More often, it feels like humility, practiced daily. He was learning to choose differently, not once, but repeatedly, not loudly, but visibly. Not with promises, but with presence. And for the first time, since everything had unraveled, the consequences were no longer only behind him. Some of them, quiet, fragile, earned, were beginning to move forward. Choosing differently didn't undo what had already happened. That truth followed him everywhere. He felt it when conversations with his son ended sooner than he wanted, when pauses lingered a little too long, when warmth appeared briefly, then retreated, not out of cruelty, but caution. Trust, he was learning, does not rush to meet effort. It waits to see effort stays. Some evenings, his son talked freely. Other nights, he withdrew without explanation. The inconsistency wasn't rejection. It calibration, a quiet test of whether presence was temporary or reliable. He accepted it without protest. That acceptance was new. In the past, discomfort had triggered action, explanations, reassurance, solutions offered too quickly. Now, he stayed with it. He let disappointment exist without trying to neutralize it. This was the consequence phase, the part no one talks about. Not punishment, not redemption. Adjustment at work, change, had always been measurable. You implemented a strategy and watched the numbers respond. In relationships, change was less obedient. Progress appeared, then disappeared. Improvement wasn't linear. That frustrated him more than he expected. One evening, after a quiet dinner, his son retreated to his room without saying much. The old urge surfaced immediately. The need to follow, to clarify, to make sure everything was okay. He stayed where he was, not because he didn't care, but because he finally understood that chasing reassurance could undo the very trust he was trying to rebuild. Growth, he was learning, often looks like restraint. Weeks passed, patterns emerged slowly. His son began asking small questions again. Casual ones, safe ones, the kind that didn't risk disappointment if unanswered. He responded consistently, without exaggerating the importance of the moment. That mattered. Consistency teaches more than intensity ever could. His wife remained civil, composed, distant in a way that felt final but not hostile. Their conversations stayed focused on logistics, school schedules, holidays, boundaries clearly drawn. He didn't push. He understood now that accountability includes respecting what you're no longer entitled to. Some evenings, he felt the weight of what he couldn't fix settle heavily in his chest. Regret surfaced, not dramatically, but persistently. Didn't ask for attention. It simply existed. He learned to sit with it. Regret, when acknowledged, becomes instruction. It taught him which moments mattered most. It sharpened his awareness. It reminded him that love doesn't offer unlimited chances, but it does offer lessons. One afternoon, his son mentioned a future plan casually, something months away. No invitation, just information. It was a quiet sign of trust. He didn't respond with excitement or pressure. He nodded, asked a question. Let the conversation move on. That night, alone, he realized something important. Living with consequences didn't mean living in shame. It meant living attentively. The past no longer dictated his identity, but it informed his behavior. Every choice now carried context. Every action mattered more because it existed against what had already been lost. Education rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates. He had learned that love doesn't reset, that presence must be repeated, that some damage becomes permanent, and maturity lies in accepting that truth without bitterness. Living with consequences wasn't about fixing the past. It was about refusing to repeat it. And that refusal, quiet, consistent, uncelebrated, was the most meaningful choice he had made in years. He stopped expecting progress to announce itself. No milestones, no moments where everything suddenly felt repaired. Just days that asked the same question again and again. Will you show up the same way today? Some days, the answer was easy. The others, it wasn't. Showing up without guarantees meant acting without knowing whether the effort would be noticed, reciprocated, or remembered. It meant choosing presence, even when the response was muted. Especially then, he learned quickly that consistency feels thankless at first. There were no rewards for being on time, for listening fully, for staying when the conversation thinned out. Those things were simply expected, now that they were missing before. Expectation, he realized, was a sign of healing. When his son asked him to come to a school event, the request was casual, almost offhand. No emphasis, no checking tone. He said yes immediately, then followed through without fanfare. He arrived early. He stayed until the end. His son noticed, not with gratitude, but with acceptance. And that was better. Acceptance meant the behavior was beginning to feel normal. They shared dinners that were sometimes lively, sometimes quiet. Neither felt like a failure anymore. Silence no longer triggered urgency. It had become a shared space instead of a warning sign. He learned to ask questions without directing the answers, to listen without scanning for solutions, to let stories wander without steering them back to a point. This was harder than it sounded. Efficiency had trained him to compress meaning. Presence asked him to expand it. He practiced anyway. On weekends, they worked on small projects together. Nothing important, nothing impressive. Errands, repairs, tasks that created proximity without pressure. He resisted the urge to turn these moments into lessons or bonding exercises. Connection, he was learning, doesn't like being managed. His wife remained distant, but respectful. Their interactions were measured, predictable, boundaried. He didn't interpret that as rejection anymore. He saw it for what it was, the result of decisions already made. Respecting boundaries became another form of love. There were moments he wanted to explain himself again, to make sure she understood how much he had learned, how deeply he regretted what had happened. He resisted that urge, too. Explanations seek absolution. Accountability accepts limits. He focused instead on what he could control, his behavior. When schedules conflicted, he adjusted. When plans changed, he adapted without complaint. When frustration surfaced, he named it calmly or let it pass. This wasn't sacrifice. It was alignment. He noticed something unexpected happen over time. The effort stopped feeling like effort. Presence, repeated often enough, becomes habit. One evening, after a long day, his son sat beside him on the couch without prompting. No agenda, no conversation planned. They watched something forgettable together, the kind of background noise that existed simply to fill space. Halfway through, his son leaned back and rested his head against the cushion, comfortable enough to be unguarded. The moment lasted seconds, but it stayed with him because comfort, when it returns, does so quietly. He didn't celebrate it. He didn't point it out. He didn't store it as proof. He let it pass. That restraint felt like growth. Showing up without guarantees meant accepting that trust might never return fully. That forgiveness might remain partial. That some doors, once closed, only open halfway. He stopped measuring success by outcome. He measured it by integrity. Did his actions match his values today? Did he respond instead of react? Did he choose presence over ease? That became enough. Education had taught him something success never did. Fulfillment doesn't come from winning back what was lost. It comes from becoming someone who no longer loses the same way. And that transformation, slow, quiet, incomplete, was the most honest kind of love he had ever practiced. Time didn't pause to acknowledge his effort. It moved the way it always had, indifferent, steady, unconcerned with intention. Days passed. Weeks layered themselves quietly on top of one another. Seasons shifted without ceremony. He learned to move with them. Mornings became simpler. Coffee made and finished while it was still warm. Phones left face down during conversations. Evenings shaped less by schedule and more by availability. None of it was dramatic. All of it was deliberate. He no longer waited for the right moment to act. He acted in the moments that arrived. Sometimes that meant showing up when it was inconvenient. Other times, it meant stepping back when presence wasn't welcome. He learned that love isn't just about being there. It's about knowing when to be quiet, when to listen, when to let others lead. That discernment took time. His son grew into himself slowly. Confidence returned in small increments. An unsolicited story, a question asked without hesitation, a laugh that came easily instead of cautiously. Trust didn't rush back. It didn't need to. It settled, not as certainty, but as comfort. They began to share moments that didn't feel like tests. A drive that wasn't weighted with meaning. A meal eaten without careful monitoring of tone. Silence that felt companionable instead of strained. These were the rewards no one applauds. He didn't mistake them for closure. He understood now that closure is a luxury we often don't get. Life rarely wraps things up cleanly. More often, it asks us to live well with what remains unresolved. His relationship with his wife stayed defined by distance and respect. There was no reconciliation, no rewriting of history, and strangely, that honesty felt stabilizing. He stopped imagining alternate outcomes. What if thinking had kept him stuck for too long? Instead, he focused on what was real, what could still be influenced by choice, effort, and restraint. He accepted that some consequences weren't meant to be undone, only carried with integrity. That acceptance softened him. One morning, back in the old house, to pick something up, he stood again in the kitchen. The clock above the sink ticked evenly, the second hand moving without hesitation now. He watched it for a moment, not with guilt, not with regret, but with awareness. Time had never betrayed him. He had simply misunderstood it. Time doesn't wait for readiness. It responds to action. He smiled faintly and turned away, locking the door behind him. Outside, the air was cool, honest. The day was already in motion. He walked toward his car, phone in his pocket, attention present, and thought about the lesson he had learned too late, but not too late to matter. Love isn't proven by grand gestures or remembered successes. It's proven by what we choose in ordinary moments, by the knock we don't postpone, by the conversation we don't delay, by the people we choose again and again, even when choosing them costs us comfort. He hadn't been ruined by losing everything. He had been reshaped by understanding what truly mattered. And though his life would never look the way it once had, it finally felt honest. Time moved forward. This time, he moved with it. Some lessons don't arrive in time to save what we lost. They arrive in time to change who we become. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that love lives in ordinary moments and quiet choices, like this video, share it with someone who needs perspective, and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more stories that explore love, consequence, and growth.